So we've been using the calculator to help us factor polynomials, and we've learned how to factor quadratics, trinomials. But you can also use the graph of a polynomial to help you find its factors. The reality is this is actually easier than factoring the way we've been learning, but the problem is it doesn't work every single time, and so that's why we have to learn how to do both. But to use the graph, all we have to look at is what's called a polynomial's roots. And the roots are the values at which the graph crosses the x-axis. So if you imagine, here's my x-axis, here's my y-axis. If I graphed a polynomial, a quadratic, my roots would be this point and this point. They're the two places where the graph crosses the x-axis. So the rule says that to find the factors of a polynomial from its graph, follow this rule. If the number b is a root, then x minus b is a factor. So if I told you we had a graph with roots of -2 and +5, what that tells us is that our factors are going to be x plus 2 and x minus 5. So notice they switch signs, and that's always going to be the case. So if you had roots of 7 and -3, then that would tell you that your factors were x minus 7 and x plus 3. So finding roots by graphing not only works for quadratics, that is polynomials with second degree, so it doesn't just work for x squared, it works for polynomials of higher degree as well. And it is true that two polynomials can have the same roots but have different graphs. That is possible. So let's look at this one down here. I will tell you the hardest thing about this quiz is figuring out what these numbers represent. That really is the hardest thing, because this isn't 1, 2, 3, 4, 10. That doesn't make any sense. So what each of these lines represents here is 2. So this is 2, 4, 6, 8. So the question said find the roots of this polynomial. Well, the roots are where it crosses the x-axis, so this point and this point. The roots are +2 and +4. So this means that our factors are going to be x minus 2 and x minus 4. That's our factorization. We're done. We figured it out. So if we look at this graph, now this one, instead of having 2 roots, this one has 3 roots, but we still work the problem out the exact same way. So here's the first root, here's the second one, and here's the third one. And again, since this number is 10 right here, that tells us the scale is 2. So my roots are +2, +4, and +6. So my factorization would be x minus 2, x minus 4, and x minus 6. Now, sometimes you have graphs that don't cross or meet the x-axis. So that means that if this is my graph, it looks like this. So notice it never touches the x-axis. Here's the x-axis in blue. That graph never touches it. So if that's the case, then it does not have real roots. That means they don't have factors in the form of ax plus b, where a and b are real numbers. Now, this does mean they have imaginary roots, but we don't get into imaginary roots until Algebra 2. But this is on your quiz. This is a vocabulary thing. So if you have a question that says, okay, it tells us to graph y equals x squared minus 4x plus 4 on the axis below. So I've already graphed it. So I'm just going to draw what the picture looks like. And it looks something like this. On the next page, I'm not going to flip over to that, but you can if you want to. It asks you how many roots does it have. When it asks you how many roots, what it's asking you is how many times does the graph cross the x-axis. When it asks you how many roots there are, it's asking you how many times does the graph cross or touch the x-axis. Well, this graph only touches 1 time, so the answer here would be 1. So if you graphed a function and it looked like this, well, this particular graph crosses or touches the x-axis twice, so it would have 2 roots. If you had a graph that looked like this, This graph never crosses or touches the x-axis, so it would have 0 roots. I know this isn't in your notes necessarily anywhere, but it might not be a bad idea for you to write it down. And we're actually going to skip the next page of the notes and move on to the 4th page. Now, when we start talking about the factorization of some of these graphs, when you have a graph that looks like this, and this graph only has one root, because it only touches the axis one time. The way we write this factorization is special, okay? This particular root right here is called a repeated root. And what that means is that when you did your factorization, the two parentheses were exactly the same. So this root is at -3. That's what this value is right there, is -3. We can tell that because it's between 2 and 4. So that means our factorization is x plus 3 times x plus 3. So notice these two have to be the same, okay? Or we could also write this as x plus 3 squared. That would be another way we could write this factorization. And this is going to be true of any polynomial or any graph where it only touches the x-axis once. This is the way the factorization has to look. So if we look at problems 1 and 3, the question says to write the factorization of the polynomial in the graph, assume the polynomial has no constant factor. So that just means we're trying to figure out what are the roots. So when we look at the roots, looking at, again, where it crosses the x-axis. Well, pay attention here. This one, look, this is -5, this is +5, so that tells us each of these lines is only 1. So its roots in this case are -1 and +2. So the factors would be x plus 1 and x minus 2. And if you look at number 3, we got to figure out what our roots are. Well, here's one, and here's the other. And pay very close attention. So this is 10 out here. That means each of our little lines there was 2. So that's 2, 4, 6. So that means this root is 1, and this root is 5. So my roots are +1 and +5. That means that my factors are going to be x minus 1 and x minus 5. I realize you don't have 9 and 10 in your notes anywhere, but I wanted to talk about at least one of them with you, just to go over this whole double root thing, repeated root. So this one right here, because it only touches the graph one time, that means it's called a repeated root. And the root is actually at -2, so that means the factor is x plus 2 squared, or x plus 2 times x plus 2. And number 10 would work the exact same way. So my root here is +3. So this means that my factor is x minus 3 squared.